Hello, everybody. Happy post 420. It is April 21st. So I hope you guys had a good celebration. And we're going to kick the webinar off here in a couple of minutes. I don't know if y'all could hear that, but I am live streaming us onto YouTube and it was playing some audio back. So I just muted it. Hopefully that stops the echoing, but yeah, I'm excited. Today's topic is talking with your parents about cannabis. And I feel super fortunate because we are a family business. So my parents for sure know about cannabis and now about my cannabis consumption. And I am grateful for that, but I know that not everybody has that same opportunity to have that open conversation and discussion with their family members. And really, this presentation can be applied to other conversations. And my hope is that this discussion will empower you with information and make it a little bit more easy to navigate how to approach having that conversation, because there is some negative stigma around cannabis still, unfortunately. And I'll get into it more in the presentation, but we're going to go over a little bit of the history of cannabis and how it became so challenging and bring it up into present day where, we have more and more states legalizing, I feel, every couple of months, every year for sure. Not Texas, not yet. We're a little bit on the slower side, but hemp's federal legalization certainly opened up the dialogue, opened up the door for more acceptance and understanding really around cannabis. So I think that that's been a helpful step towards being able to open it up and normalize talking about cannabis. And like I said, that's what we're going to dig into today. So a couple more minutes just in case anybody else wants to tune in. Otherwise, these videos do get recorded. We really want to make sure that everybody has access to education and resources. If you've been tuning into Restart content for a while, you know that we are not the keeper of information. We like to share it out. We encourage you to do your own research, to connect with other resources, to explore and be canna curious, right? But we definitely want to help establish some sort of thought leadership by being somebody who can bring these ideas to our community to help empower you to have different conversations, to explore, again, your canna curiosity, and to really continue to champion cannabis forward. Because, like I was mentioning, it is becoming more legal in certain capacities, and yet we still hit stigma every day. So one more minute, and then we will be going straight into the presentation because I have a lot of stuff to cover. And I'll go over it when we kick off the presentation. But if you have questions, feel free to ask them at the end. We'll go over a brief Q&A. If you're watching this on YouTube or Facebook or something after the fact, drop them in the chat. You can always reach out to our team. We're more than happy to answer your questions. But without further ado, let's dive right in. We are at 12 on the spot. So the webinar is talking with your parents about cannabis. I'm Shada Tarabi. I am the co-founder and CEO of Restart CBD, and I'm your presenter today. So if you've heard of Restart, we appreciate you. Thanks for supporting us. Thanks for tuning into our webinars, to our content. If you're not familiar with Restart, we are a sister-owned brand that was founded in Austin, Texas in 2018. We were one of the first operators. I've won some cannabis awards. Restart has won some awards here locally, and we are the #1 rated shop. I don't share those things to toot our horns. I share those to establish credibility. Again, thought leadership. We like to invest in these areas of education to, again, really empower our end consumer and community. And I think that the proof is in the pudding, right? So being able to be a leader is something that we're really proud of being able to step into. And so I just want to let you know that, we know some stuff and we want to share that information with y'all. We have a brick and mortar in North Austin. If you want to come shop with us, we're open every day except for Sundays, and you can shop with us 24/7 online at restartcbd.com. Love having these little disclaimers because I think it's important, especially as we're approaching this conversation of talking with your parents or perhaps your grandparents or perhaps friends that may not be super familiar with cannabis. We get it. Cannabis and shopping for cannabis can be super overwhelming. But we're hoping with our help, with Restart CBD's help, it doesn't have to be. And this is a legal disclaimer. I'm not a doctor. I'm also not a lawyer, and I encourage everybody to always do continuous research on everything that I share. At the end of the presentation, I will provide more resources for you to continue your canna curiosity. So, like I said, we're diving right into the meat of things because there's a lot of things to talk about when it comes to cannabis. If you're just tuning in and you missed the beginning, I want to reiterate, I'm really fortunate. This is a picture of my parents, Mike and Jenny. We are a sister-owned cannabis brand. And with that sisterhood comes our family's inclusion into the conversation, right? And I'm super fortunate. I can't say that historically it was always open. I think especially as a teenager going through high school and college, it wasn't like, hey, mom and dad, I like cannabis, so be cool with it. No, there was definitely a little bit of hiding it, not knowing if I could come out and tell my parents I liked cannabis, having those, kind of secretive moments, and then ultimately breaking through I enjoy this plant and I hope that you can understand that, and really being able to make a relationship with my parents that was open and rooted in understanding where each other was coming from. I also acknowledge not everybody's parent is maybe going to be on the receiving end, so accepting, right? Sometimes your parents might not care. Sometimes they're going to care, especially if you're on the younger age. Maybe your parents are still involved in your day-to-day life, and it might not be something that is super easy for you to be able to communicate to them. But no matter where you stand with communicating to your parents on cannabis, again, I hope this presentation can empower you and inform you and educate you on things that you can bring to the table to really help adjust and ease that awareness for them on maybe seeing cannabis in a different perspective and light. Another kind of aspect I'll share, because I think I get asked a lot, oh, what's it like with your family being so accepting of cannabis? And living in Austin, Austin is a very cannabis friendly city. If you're from Austin, if you live in Austin, but we kind of live in a bubble sometimes. So you're looking sometimes at the smaller cities outside of Austin, just in Texas in general. You look at other states that even have legalized, states like California. Just because the state of California is legal, you can still have dry counties, meaning those counties have decided not to allow cannabis sales. We now live in a day and age where marijuana is still a Schedule I drug, but hemp is not. So you can kind of ease people in maybe from a hemp perspective, depending on where they're living. So there's a lot of movement happening, and yet still certain areas that might not be as aware or accessible to cannabis products. And I totally get that. But speaking from my own experience, I live in a little bit of a bubble because everybody around me knows I love cannabis. My family knows I consume it. They're certainly a part of the business with me to some extent. And yet I have encountered, especially recently, just some conversations with some friends, family members who, conversations start to happen, and their true feelings about cannabis have started to come out. And it's made me realize, wow, okay, not everybody is super comfortable with this. How do we approach this? So going into this, I just want you to know, not everybody is going to understand and not everybody is going to see eye to eye, but there are certain pieces of information that I think can help empower that conversation. So first and foremost, I think it's really important to start with history. I don't know how much you guys know about the history of cannabis, how cannabis really went from originally making it on the Schedule I list to, again, now we have hemp's legalization, and CBD in particular was descheduled. But I find myself really steeped in the industry, and yet there's so much information that I just didn't know until I started doing research. And so I can imagine you might be in the same position. You're like, yeah, I consume cannabis. Of course, I'm comfortable with it. But do you really understand how cannabis got to the current stigma and status that maybe not, let's say presently, but probably the last, 20 years or so, the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, where you've seen cannabis kind of go through, especially some of these, examples here on the screen. So Reefer Madness, the DARE program. So a lot of our beliefs about cannabis come from its legal status as a Schedule I drug, predominantly being driven by the Nixon administration and their war on drugs, which led to anti-cannabis propaganda. Again, thinking of these generations that were experiencing the transition of how cannabis was being classified and what media was being put out during that time period. And that's just, what people were absorbing, and that's where they were building their beliefs around. On top of that, anti-drug programs like DARE. And then you can see how quickly the perception of this plant goes really south. So to begin this conversation, I really think it's important to dive into the history of cannabis and how we got here. So buckle up because there's a lot of history to go through. But again, I think it's really important to understand these points because as you're talking to your parents, loved ones, being able to kind of explain to them like facts, right? It's not, well, I feel or I like cannabis, so you need to accept it. It's, do you know why cannabis is even a Schedule 1 drug in the first place? Is a really great way to approach a conversation. And so getting into some of that understanding is what we're going to do right now. So this is a timeline. I've put this together in a few other pieces of content that I've created, and I thought that this was really relevant to reshare with you guys in this capacity. So I basically have a timeline going from the 1800s all the way to present day, and we're going to walk through some of that together. So I don't know if y'all knew this, but in the 1800s, medical cannabis was used to treat nausea, rheumatism, and labor pain, among other ailments. It was really interesting when I was researching this, you know, you kind of heard and you hear things, you've heard things, perhaps, at least I had, that cannabis used to be a drug. And in fact, this Park Davis and Company example, Park Davis and Company, if you Google it, is actually a subsidiary of Pfizer presently. So it's interesting that these were real products that were put forth by, I don't want to say legitimate medical companies, but by well-known brands, right? So you had brands like Park Davis and Company that were selling cannabis extracts. On the other hand of the screen, you're seeing cannabis indica is a term being used a lot. These were actual medicines that were available and in population circulation in the 1800s. So when you're looking at cannabis, it used to be very popular and very accessible and very much used from a medicinal perspective. But how did we get to cannabis becoming a Schedule 1 drug? Then in the 1860s, restrictions on cannabis as a drug actually started in local laws in the state of New York. So New York was kind of one of the first states to say, I don't know, let's kind of review this cannabis thing. And what I'll caveat it with also is the progression of how unstructured things went. So the next one, talking about Pure Food and Drug Act regulating, the Pure Food and Drug Act is a step towards the FDA, right? So if you can imagine, before 1906, there was no Pure Food and Drug Act, there was no FDA, so there was no standard. So you really could put anything you wanted into a product and sell it to a consumer if you had really great label, really great go-to-market strategies. So the progression of standardization of labeling, those are good things. Like, you want as a consumer to have assurance, quality assurance, to know what's going in your body. So again, thinking of the timeline as this is just the progression of how society was going, and cannabis just happened to be one of those ingredients that, as more people became, I guess, aware of it, there's always a negative side to the positive benefit, right? So yes, you're using cannabis as medicine, but there could also be a negative connotation of who's profiting and who's losing. So looking at cannabis as an ingredient and what other ingredients they could put in place from a medicinal perspective. So always keep that in mind. So restrictions started happening in New York. Then the Pure Food and Drug Act regulated the labeling of medicines containing cannabis indica. So the Pure Food and Drug Act was the first legislation in the country that sought to regulate pharmaceuticals and food products by requiring truth in labeling on products, creating inspectors of the drug and food manufacturing process, in creating a list of 10 dangerous drugs that had to be labeled at all times. Again, this is the progression of society. We're now being more aware of what we're putting in our bodies, and cannabis is kind of coming up as one of those things. Now, where it starts to get really interesting is from 1906 to 1936, over a 30-year span. I didn't include all the details, right? Because there's just so much when you start to unpack it. But my hope is that this is a very curious jumping off point for you to go to the internet and be like, ooh, I want to see what was happening in 1906 or 1936. It's really fascinating when you start to look at who was in office, what was driving them, and really seeing the influence that these policymakers and these politicians actually had on putting cannabis in this position. So in 1936, a film called Reefer Madness was created and suggested that evil marijuana dealers lurked in public schools, waiting to entice their children into a life of crime and degeneracy. I remember kind of getting exposed to cannabis in my teens and hearing of Reefer Madness. Again, I'm sure everybody's heard of Reefer Madness, but at that time, I didn't really associate that as being one of the major pillars of turning cannabis into this demon. It's interesting when you see propaganda to not really fathom that was literal propaganda. Like this was being put in the media, in newspapers, and movies, and scaring people. I didn't really include it, but like the story kind of behind it, right? There was a lot of, what is the word? There was a lot of immigration happening between Mexico into the United States. And actually, the Hispanics were heavy users of marijuana. Sometimes that's why you might see it spelled with an H, marijuana. Well, Mexico also has a city called Tijuana. And there's a little bit of racism, maybe a lot of racism in there, right? Where over this period of time of the media kind of infiltrating this narrative with this demonic kind of approach, there's a lot of racism being incorporated. The J is being replaced for the H, marijuana related to Tijuana, giving more of a Hispanic influx into cannabis, right? And so when you're looking at all this propaganda, you're realizing, wow, like why are they positioning it this way? And it's because it was the media. That was how they wanted it to be portrayed, because it was who's the politician or the policymakers behind it who are influencing what is happening. So a little bit about Reefer Madness. Reefer Madness, originally made as Tell Your Children and sometimes titled The Burning Question, Dope Addict, Doped Youth, and Love Madness, was a 1936 American propaganda film about drugs revolving around the melodramatic events that ensue when high school students are lured by pushers to try marijuana. From a hit and run accident to manslaughter, suicide, conspiracy to murder, rape, hallucinations, and descent into madness, all because of marijuana addiction. It was originally financed by a church group. So again, getting into some of this, church and state kind of issues. Under the title Tell Your Children, the film was intended to be shown to parents as a morality tale, attempting to teach them about the dangers of cannabis use. And soon on, the film was rediscovered in the early 1970s and gained a new life as an unintentional satire among cannabis policy reform. Again, it's one of those things you really need to look beyond just cannabis is a Schedule 1 drug. Like why? Why is cannabis a Schedule 1 drug? This is kind of the beginning of where cannabis started to be turned into this political weapon, unfortunately. 1937, while America was familiar with cannabis in their tinctures and medicine, again from the 1800s, marijuana was demonized, and the Marijuana, like I said, was spelled with an H, Tax Act, that's literally how it was spelled. The Marijuana Tax Act banned the use and sale of cannabis in the US. So these are real tax stamps from that period. And what I really wanted to highlight more than anything was where their states coming from. This one says Oklahoma, Kentucky, Wisconsin. That signifies to me that cannabis was accepted and adopted beyond just what we kind of know of cannabis today. This was a national thing. Cannabis was being used in medicines. And so the Tax Act made an implication that it was more difficult to have access to and incorporate, and you had to have a tax if you were going to be using cannabis in your product. So increasingly raising the bar to make it more difficult for cannabis access. And then in 1964, THC was discovered. So you have cannabis and cannabis extracts, but there wasn't really any conversation around THC as a psychotropic, or CBD or CBG or CBN. And if you're in the cannabis industry or you're a cannabis consumer, you're probably very familiar with Dr. Meshulam. He is the one credited for discovering both THC and identifying it as a psychotropic cannabinoid, but also the person who discovered the endocannabinoid system. So THC was discovered in 1964, and it was discovered by Raphael Meshulam in Israel. And until the discovery and isolation of Delta 9, and then the THC, in case you're unaware, stands for tetrahydrocannabinol. Again, you have an endocannabinoid system. Cannabis is usually a cannabinoid, THC, cannabinol, they all kind of flow together, right? Scientists didn't understand what caused the psychoactive effect in cannabis. Since then, multiple components, compounds, including THC, CBD, CBC, and CBG, not to mention terpenes and flavonoids, have been identified within the cannabis plant. So this guy is really important to understand the science behind cannabis and bringing that to the market to help us get more awareness and understanding. And also creating, I think, unintentional. I think he was like, oh, we're going to discover THC and then it's going to go, south. But him being able to pinpoint and attribute the effects and what is the compound giving that effect, I think was really significant just in the progression and adoption of cannabis, bringing it all the way into 2022, right? We now love being able to determine different cannabinoids for different effects. The last one on this slide, cannabis is categorized as a Schedule I drug in 1970, which limited further research and was listed as having no accepted medical use. So again, this is really interesting when you start to look at who was the president, Nixon, what was driving them. I think it's really fascinating, especially as hemp became legal, you start to realize who who benefited by making hemp go away and lumping in hemp with marijuana. And I think when you look at hemp's many uses, which I do have a slide talking about it as a fiber, it as agriculture feed, it as so many things from paper to hemp seed for food. Obviously, there's the extraction, like there's hempcrete, building materials. There's so many applications to hemp, and yet at the same time, we really pigeonholed it into marijuana and this THC effect, and that being like bad, that we removed the whole plant from our existence. And when you start to dig into some of the reasons that I personally have kind of like come to believe why cannabis became a Schedule I drug, it definitely has to do with racism. I think it has to do with politics and profit, who was benefiting at the time. And especially when you're looking at the media side of things, Hearst is a very famous last name in the media, and he is associated to this conversation actually in the sense that he owned a lot of printing presses and a lot of media, especially during this time frame, kind of in the 1900s. And it benefited him to have cotton be a more profitable crop and having paper be a more profitable crop, especially from a media, your printing press perspective. And so because he had stock in those other industries, he wanted to diminish hemp and cannabis as a result as something that was accessible to the population. So again, there's a lot of influence into why these things became illegal in the first place that aren't just, it's the devil's lettuce. It's no, you were or weren't profiting from this plant, and you had a lot of influence and had a way to convince through propaganda and media relations to make this a huge smear campaign. And again, as like an adult now, reflecting back on the first time I had heard of Reefer Madness, I'm like, oh my God, no, not only was it like propaganda in the true sense of propaganda, it literally convinced people that this was this demon plant. And so the influence then of everyday people being like, nope, not for me, not for my children, increasing, programs like DARE, things like that. Like you can see the progression when you look at it from a linear perspective, right? So this is just a little quick slide on drug scheduling because I think it's so interesting. So we know what THC and CBD do, and especially in, the capacity of our own personal health and wellness journeys. So these are the schedules of drugs. You can see THCs are in the same schedule as heroin, codeine, and morphine. Which to me doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense. Schedule 2 is opium, fentanyl, methadone. Schedule 3 is amphetamines, barbiturates, acids. And then Schedule 4, some of these words are hard to say, right? Phenobarbital. And then Schedule 5, specific mixtures of narcotics with non-narcotics. If you ask me, do I think that cannabis and marijuana in particular should be a Schedule I drug? Absolutely not. Especially when you look at why it was listed as a Schedule I, it's because it said that it has no medical purpose. And yet, if you look back to the 1800s, it clearly was only being used as medicine. So again, to me, something doesn't make sense. And that's where we have the task, the opportunity, the pleasure of helping educate people and making them realize this is not this demon propaganda plant. There is so much beauty and goodness to it. We have to understand where we came from to understand where we're going. So this is the timeline continued. 1973, Oregon becomes the first state to decriminalize cannabis, reducing the penalty for less than 1 ounce to $100 fine. And then in 1988, the endocannabinoid system was discovered, and our bodies have an endocannabinoid system with a CB1 and a CB2 receptors, which are some of the most abundant neuroreceptors in the brain. If you are really curious to understand more about the endocannabinoid system, check out our webinars. They're on our YouTube, Restart CBD. I did a whole webinar on the endocannabinoid system. But again, kind of like the brief highlight, think of the endocannabinoid system as regulating things like appetite, motor activity, pain perception. It helps regulate your gut, your immune system, your liver, your pancreas, skin. So depending on the CB1 versus the CB2, as you can see, CB1 is predominantly in your head. CB2 receptors are more dispersed throughout your body, but predominantly located in your gut, intestines, digestion part of your body. And different cannabinoids will play on different receptors, and they will also work together, called the entourage effect, and produce not want to say different effects, but effects can vary based on isolating cannabinoids or taking cannabinoids in conjunction with each other. So we have an endocannabinoid system. Again, it is called the endocannabinoid system, whether you consume cannabis or not. So I think that's a fun fact, right? If you're talking to your parents, it's like, did you know that you have this endocannabinoid system? What's an endocannabinoid system? Well, it regulates all these things. Did you know that CBD and THC are cannabinoids? And they function by interacting with your endocannabinoid system. So again, I think communicating to your loved ones that this is part science and part unraveling fact from fiction is a really good place to go and explore the canna curiosity of talking to your parents and your loved ones about cannabis. 1996, California was the first state to establish medical cannabis, allowing people the right to use cannabis for any illness with a doctor's recommendation. This is just a quick little timeline of kind of the progression of how states have legalized. So 1996, California becomes the first state to legalize. Then you have Colorado and Washington legalized in 2012. Alaska and Oregon and the District of Columbia legalized recreation in 2014. Then you see California, Maine, Massachusetts, and Nevada approve rec in 2016, Michigan and Vermont legalized in 2018, and so on and so forth. So California was kind of one of those first to step up and say, actually, there is medical value with this. Let's talk about it. Let's make this accessible for our community. And then you can see the dominoes start to trickle down. Yes, 96 to 2012, there was a little bit of a break. But I think it's just because there's so much stigma around this plant, right? And so how do you start to etch away at it with education, talking, having open conversations and dialogue, and exploring canna curiosity, both with yourself and with the people around you. 2012, Colorado and Washington became the first two states to legalize. 2018, hemp was federally legalized and removed the definition of hemp from marijuana in the Controlled Substances Act. So again, when you look at the controlled substances, marijuana is unfortunately federally illegal, but hemp is federally legal, which is what allows for us to ship our products nationwide, for us to consume in states like Texas, even where marijuana is not legal here. And again, a reminder, the cannabinoids, THC, CBD, CBN, et cetera, they exist in both marijuana and hemp. They're the same cannabinoids, they're the same chemical compounds. It doesn't change. So having that understanding of marijuana versus hemp, but hemp's legal, it's like you can get the same cannabinoids from both. And so at that point, how do we start to educate and communicate the value of the cannabinoids, the terpenes, and the flavonoids to our parents so that they can find benefit and relief with how these cannabinoids function, whether something is a Schedule 1 drug or removed from the Schedule 1 list altogether. And then last piece on the timeline is 2022, present day. I believe this number is accurate. We just had New Mexico go adult use recreation April 1st, so beginning of this month. But in total, there are 37 states that have legalized the medical use of marijuana, and 19 states have legalized it for recreational purposes. So, I'm going to skip back really quick. This is just a slide on hemp. I meant to go to this one before I went to the state one, but just to go back, tracking a little bit, like I was mentioning earlier about hemp, hemp has so many applications. And I think that this is a really good slide to highlight. It's not just about getting high. It's about having access to this plant that has other benefits for society. And maybe that's a place for your parents to start. Maybe it's talking to them all about hemp and maybe getting them used to wearing some hemp clothing or trying hemp seeds in their smoothies or their smoothie bowls. And so understanding the plant having so many more uses is really important. But I will say marijuana doesn't have the same application as hemp from a seed, stalk, leaves, root perspective necessarily. Hemp is a little bit more sturdy of a plant, it's a little bit more fibrous, which is why you see it having more agricultural applications, and marijuana really just being more from a medicinal and recreational perspective. But quickly to go over it, these are different things that you can do with hemp, and I think it's so cool. So you can use hemp in oil paints, varnishes, printing inks, fuel, solvents, coatings. From a food perspective, hemp seed hearts. I'm sure you've had hemp seeds, like I said, in your smoothie. Hemp seed oil, hemp protein powder, food supplements. What I will say from a food perspective, it's not that these products will contain cannabinoids. So again, hemp derived is different than hemp extracted. So hemp seeds or hemp oil does not always mean that it's going to contain CBD, for example. You might find a product that has put the CBD extract back into that product, but kind of trying to separate out these things for you guys. Body care, you can make hemp soap, shampoos, lotions, balms, cosmetics. The leaves are very absorbent and good for animal bedding, really good for mulching and composting. I mentioned earlier, building materials, hempcrete, fiberboard, insulation, acrylics, and a fiberglass substitute. From a textiles, you can make rope with it. I don't know if y'all knew this, but rope and canvas, actually from the Mayflower, when Christopher Columbus was migrating over and discovering America, there are records showing that the sails and the rope that were on these boats were actually made with hemp materials. And when they were coming over to colonize America, it was encouraged for them to grow X amount of hemp crops to support creating these products and textiles that they were leveraging from these plants. So again, these plants have been used for many, many years prior to modern society kind of getting its hands on it, messing with it, and ultimately demonizing it. Textiles, clothing, diapers, handbags, denim, shoes, paper, printing, newspapers, cardboard, packaging, ropes, canvas, tarps, carpeting. There's so much beauty to this plant. And I hope that, again, these are talking points that you can highlight with your parents and your loved ones to say, maybe you want to try some hemp clothing. Maybe we can try a hemp seed smoothie. Maybe you want to make some business cards on hemp paper. I will say it's not as accessible as you will think because the industry has been throttled for so long that it's just beginning. I mean, we just legalized hemp in 2018. So what you'll see, unfortunately, is a lot of the hemp fiber, for example, is coming from overseas because we just don't have the processing plants here in America. So it's just kind of like an aside. I think the natural instinct is like, oh, well, I got to go do all these things with hemp. But the reality is there's only so much that you can do until you have more adoption of it. So again, my hope is that we will be educated and adopting more of these things and seeing more of cannabis, hemp being incorporated into our everyday lives. And seeing our parents rock some hemp clothing would be pretty dope. Now going into the state slide. So this is just an updated slide. And I always think it's really, it makes me laugh because it shows Texas having no program for legal THC. This is a new map I pulled from 2022 because as you can see, New Mexico is legal for recreational use. It's from Rolling Stones, but yeah, I'll call it out. Texas does have a very immature medical marijuana program. It's capped at 1%. We only have 2 dispensaries. They're both in South Austin. It is not an accessible program. And so therefore, to me, it doesn't really qualify as medical because how do people get their medicine? It's a very, very immature program. I always hope that these programs will be improved because we need that progress to happen so that we can see recreational adoption in our state. But I just want to kind of highlight that. Sometimes people get mad. They're like, Texas has a medical program. I'm like, it does kind of. So again, separate conversation, another day. Happy to have conversations offline about it. But just wanted to give you guys an update that we have a lot of states that are saying yes to cannabis. So it is a matter of time before you see it impacting the federal schedule status. It is a matter of time before you see Texas adopting it, but progress. We're making progress. So now you have all this information, you're armed, you got research, you're like, okay, cool, got it. Now I'm going to go have this conversation, getting ready to discuss cannabis. Let's say you're sitting down with your loved one, you're sitting down with your mom, your dad, your grandma, your grandpa. How are you going to approach the conversation? Like, what are you going to talk to them about? Are you going to just word vomit? Maybe you want to show them this webinar. Like I said, we'll put this on YouTube and you can just push play and say, here, watch the first, 30 minutes and Shada is going to educate you on the history of cannabis. I think that is a good step in the direction, right? But there's a lot more that we can be doing. So one, understand why you use cannabis. I think it's really important to ask yourself, why am I using cannabis in the first place and how is it benefiting me? When you are going to have conversations with your loved ones, you want to understand what it's actually doing for you. Yes, I'll be the first to say I love using cannabis recreationally. I also don't consume a lot of alcohol and I don't really consume a lot of other vices that other people might enjoy. So for me, a lot of the times the conversation is, well, I use cannabis from a medicinal perspective because of my car accident. I'm not on opioids and I very easily could be. And so this is a tangible way for me to be in control of feeling better because I've learned different products, different doses, and giving it to myself so I can, again, be in control of how I can manage my pain. The other side is recreationally. Absolutely. I do not consume X, Y, or Z, but I really enjoy cannabis. And here's why. Here's what it benefits me. Here's what it does for me. So understanding why you're using it and how you're using it is really important, I think, to extending that olive branch of saying, understand me a little bit better so I can understand you a little bit better too. So two, gauging your parents or loved ones' views on cannabis. I don't know if you've had conversations with your parents or loved ones, or it's just kind of like all in your head. You're thinking, oh my gosh, my parents are going to automatically think this is the devil's weed. How do I talk to them about it? I think it can be really important to understand why your parents might have the beliefs or the views that they have too, right? Did they have an experience in the past? Maybe they tried THC pot brownies in college and had a really bad experience. And now their only awareness of cannabis is THC and having this horrible, paranoid, anxious experience. And they don't want to have that again. So they've been very trepidatious to pursue CBD products because they think CBD and THC might be the same. They're not really sure. And so therefore now they're just kind of anti-cannabis. So, have they had their own experiences? How did they find it? Did someone introduce it to them? Did they go to a dispensary for, the first time on a vacation trip somewhere? And how did that affect their views about cannabis use in any way? Going back to the timeline, we grow up in different generations. And so depending on what president was in office, depending on what public school you may or may not would have gone to, different programs would have been in place. I know for me, I ended up going to private school and we didn't actually have DARE in school. So, maybe jokes on them and me because I was never influenced personally to see cannabis negatively, like don't do drugs. I certainly saw it as I got older, just in propaganda. I mean, aware of DARE. I just never went through that program personally. But you might be somebody who's like, no, I went through the DARE program. I was scared shitless and I did not want to touch cannabis for X, Y, or Z reason. So it really comes down to the time and the place. Where did you grow up? What was the sentiment? I could imagine, for example, too, right, being in Austin, it is a little bit more normalized here. But if I grew up maybe in a small town outside of Austin, like Bastrop or Elgin, maybe it would be a little bit more reserved because it's a little bit more of a conservative upbringing, conservative environment. And so it's just things to consider depending on how that person grew up and what they were exposed to and really where they were existing in their period of life and time that has influenced and shaped them for the better or for the worse, unfortunately, with cannabis, right? And then kind of like the third component I think is really important is doing your own research, understanding what resources might help bridge the conversation. And y'all know that we love resources. We love to be able to empower you guys with more information. There are more, I don't want to say a lot, but there's more and more scientific medical studies being done. And you can find those by just typing in cannabis and cancer, cannabis and chronic pain, CBD and chronic pain, and seeing what you discover on the internet. Again, I always encourage you guys to do your own research in general, see what's out there, make those decisions of what you're putting in your body for yourself. So maybe having a medical study to go to your parent who just got diagnosed with cancer and saying, this could be something that I really would like you to try. And here's why, and here's some quantitative and qualitative resources can help maybe bridge that gap to make them a little bit more understanding. And maybe it's really, understanding the history of the plant. So again, going through some of the history that I shared in the beginning, maybe it's a particular one of those points really stood out to you and you're like, I got to tell it to my dad. He's going to really love it. Or maybe it'll help him see cannabis a little bit differently. History's crazy. It's crazy to see where we've come from and where we're going and how much history has really influenced present day. And the other thing is understanding legally. We get a lot of people who come into the store and they're like, oh, well, my parents live in California, so they're obviously very exposed to cannabis, or they're asking me questions, or a little more open-minded, versus, let's say, maybe your parent lives in Idaho. Idaho, I know, does not have as friendly cannabis laws and does not have legalization. So depending on where they're living, they might have access to certain products and not others. And I think that's always worth exploring, because you want them to feel comfortable with where their jurisdiction is. Again, in Austin, cannabis is pretty much decriminalized. So we have a little bit more flexibility in people's temperature for pursuing it, compared to, again, maybe a smaller town or a suburb where the law enforcement in the jurisdiction is executed differently, and there could be a little bit more cause for concern. So do your research is the whole point of that, right? And then for exploring and educating with different options, I am the biggest proponent. Not everybody wants to get high, and that's okay. Not everybody wants to smoke, and that's okay. I think, unfortunately, when you're looking at the propaganda of cannabis, it's all kind of put into smokables. Everybody's going to be smoking dope, and smoking is the only way to experience, and it's all THC and it's all high. That is not what cannabis is. That is not what cannabis should be. But getting people comfortable to explore is a hurdle. So thank you for tuning in, because you are helping erode some of that stigma by being open to these conversations. And so exploring and educating different options. And in my world, different options kind of comes down to two different filters. One, is it a smokable? Is it an edible? Is it a topical? Is it a capsule? There are different products kind of from these, but these are kind of the main categories, right? You're ingesting something that is sweet, so an edible. Some people come to me and they're like, Shada, I don't like edibles. I don't want to be eating candy to get my cannabis. I say, great. Why don't you try a tincture? I totally forgot to put a tincture in here. That would have been the fifth one, a tincture. A tincture is a more approachable way, perhaps, for somebody to experience cannabis that doesn't come coated in sugar. A capsule is another solution. These are pre-dosed mechanisms so that they don't have to think, well, how many puffs do I take? How much topical do I use? I can just eat the gummy, eat the capsule, or swallow the capsule, take the tincture, and it's pre-dosed for me. Versus something like a smokable, which in my opinion is probably the most popular way to consume cannabis. But just because it's the most popular doesn't mean it's the most accessible. I think, again, coming from our perspective, we see a lot of customers come into the store, they're like, I don't want to smoke. And I always say, good, you don't have to. So what do you want to do? So being able to approach the conversation with your parents of, what is your preference? What is your lifestyle? How frequently are you going to be consuming? What do you want to consume? What are you consuming for? Those are all qualitative questions that I would want to understand, so that I can understand how to encourage them to explore based on what they are looking to experience. So again, the whole point of this is to understand and to help reiterate to your family members, there's different ways to consume. And understanding what their temperature is a great way of easing into the conversation. I'll give you another follow-up, right? We do get a lot of, I want to say, like 55 plus people coming into the store. They maybe used to smoke back in the day, but they're like, I definitely am not smoking now. And they're really nervous about getting high. They don't want to feel high. We assure them CBD is non-psychotropic. Why don't you try an isolate product? But they don't want to ingest anything. They don't want it in their system yet. So it's not that a topical won't penetrate into your bloodstream if you're using it consistently or using a large enough volume of it. But a topical might be a really good approach to say, like, hey, mom, I know you have arthritis in your hands. Why don't you just like rub this topical on your hands for a week and just see how it goes? Being able to introduce people into products that don't require them to ingest is a step in saying, try this, see how this makes you feel. And then maybe the door starts to swing open and they say, oh my gosh, I love that. That felt amazing. I want to try the next batch. I want to try the next, type of product. So we definitely see a lot of customers coming in and sharing that same experience of, I really want my mom and dad to try this, but they're not going to put it in their body. So what can we do? So topicals is usually what we promote and encourage people to do. And then we're really wrapping up the presentation. This last slide for me is different cannabinoids, right? We were talking about not everybody wants to be high. That is the beautiful thing about cannabis. These are just 4 cannabinoids. There's actually over 100, 150, 160, depending on whose resource you're reflecting on. But the point is there's a lot of them, and they have individual isolated value, and they also have value working together. So I find that being educated around different cannabinoids and understanding the effects that they might produce is really a good place to start. So if you know that your parents are really anti-THC, or your dad's getting drug tested for his job, or you really don't want your grandma being high, you can explore other non-psychotropic cannabinoids like CBD or CBG or even CBN. But if you know that your family member is looking for that type of effect, you can encourage them to try something THC, but you might say, why don't you try a THC and CBN if you're looking for something, before bed, or CBG and THC for something perhaps in the daytime. So exploring different cannabinoids is a really good way to encourage them to understand it's not just THC, it's not just about getting high. There's a lot of different ways to express and feel with the plant. And that's really our whole journey together, is to make people feel comfortable as they're exploring cannabis. The other thing I will say, you guys know this for the most part, and if you don't, I'll share it again, right? Unfortunately, I can't say all the time why people would use these cannabinoids, partially due to the FDA, partially due to just like how cannabis is regulated. There just isn't enough research substantial to say CBD is good for X, Y, or Z explicitly. It comes down to your biochemistry, your consumption, the dose, the form factor. Is it an edible? Is it a topical? Is it a smokable, etc.? And then what is the combination of cannabinoids? So unfortunately, it is not a one size fits all. It does require some education, some exploration. And so I just hope that you continue to understand that for yourself. If you're like, man, I really like trying cannabis, but I don't know if it's doing what I want it to do, try a different product, try a different dose. That's where I find the most relief for myself, is when I build out my toolkit and then I know, hey, today I want to feel X, Y, or Z, and I can go grab the different products or the different doses that I know can help me, and encouraging you guys to figure out and explore the same, both for yourself and for your loved ones. So I can't explicitly be like, CBD is good for this, that, and the other, but use these as talking points, use these as jumping off points. Go do the research, go see what is being written about CBN, CBG, there's CBC, THCV. Again, lots of cannabinoids to explore to see what the outcome could be for you. Additional resources, if you have questions, you want to direct your family members to us, you can shoot us an email, info@restartcbd.com. Our team is on top of it. They're knowledgeable, wonderful team members, and they are really, really great at responding to you guys and helping you connect the dots and point you in the right direction towards answers or products, if that's what you're pursuing. And then we do have a secret Facebook group on Facebook. It's called Secret Restart CBD Group. You can see it in the bottom right. We try to stay up to date, but it's a good peer-to-peer group. If you have a question, you can go ask it to the group and see if people have had a similar experience or a differing experience. But it's good to just like be a part of a community of other people who are navigating the same questions you're navigating, right? The whole point is you're not alone. And so how do we work together to approach these conversations? Always, always, always encourage you to talk to our team. We have retail staff, we have an online staff. Please reach out to us, social media, email. We want to support you. And another option, we have a Leaf 411 partnership. They are a nurse-run cannabis hotline. Again, maybe when you're dealing with parents, maybe they're on medication, you have some questions. How is it going to interact? How's it going to interfere? Or you just want to send your parents to talk to these medical professionals, send us a DM, ask us in an email, info@restartcbd. There is a code that we give you to make this free. They have just grown exponentially as a resource. And so they're trying to gate it so that they can help service everybody. And since we're a member, that's a service that we offer to our customers free of charge. So let us know. We can get you the code so you can talk to cannabis nurses free and have your medical questions answered. And then if you want to shop with us, we have a special code for this webinar. Parents webinar gets you 5 off 50, restartcbd.com. Again, if there's any products that you're like, man, I really love like my dad to check out, or I want to send to my grandma, we do ship our products nationwide. You can use this discount code and shop online. We are running some specials, just different products, different days. So stay tuned on our website and our Instagram to see what our daily, weekly kind of specials are. And then the next webinar is coming up next month. We, as a reminder, do them the third Thursday of every month at 12 p.m. The next one will be May 19th. And since May is Mother's Day, we thought that we would do a whole webinar on CBG because it is known as the mother of all cannabinoids. You can check out an RSVP for our new webinar at the link restartcbd.com/webinar. And if you go to our YouTube, youtube.com/restartcbd, you will see all of our previous YouTubes as well, or sorry, previous webinars on YouTube as well. So that's that. I'm going to stop the record, or I'm going to stop sharing. But if you guys have any questions, you can drop them in the chat and I will happily answer them. Otherwise, I really appreciate you guys tuning in, and hopefully this was educational and informative and empowered you with information that you can then pass on to your parents and loved ones. And then just really quick, I have a comment over here. Sean also mentioned Schedule 1 lists, the Schedule 1 category also lists is a high potential for abuse. So they're saying that, for example, cannabis, marijuana being on the Schedule 1, it means that it's a high level for abuse. That means people are going to abuse it more frequently. It can have addictive purposes. And I'm not going to say that it doesn't necessarily, right? Because I think that, like, personally, I do use cannabis very consistently, but does it have the same effects as opioids, for example? I personally believe that it does not. So I think we'll see cannabis then later because we know how politics works, but very good point. So any other questions? Otherwise, we'll wrap up and you guys get a couple minutes back for the webinar today. Okay, cool. I don't see anything coming in. I hope that you guys have a wonderful day. Thanks again for tuning into this webinar. We appreciate you guys and hope that this empowers you on your